Hey students, welcome to week 4. Good job on surviving literary criticism. I know many of you contacted me throughout the week and expressed great concern about how to navigate that. Are you doing that right? Is literary criticism as difficult as it seems? And I want to ease some of your stress a little bit. You were probably already doing literary criticism in weeks 1 and week 2. That's part of the nature of the questions that I'm asking you, is to be very critical of stories. Literary criticism, the way that your book defines it, really gives a structure and an organization to particular types or kinds of criticism. So in that way, like I said, you were probably already doing that in week 1 or week 2. Just giving it a name like formalism or a feminist approach gives it a specific direction that it may not have had otherwise. You might have been doing sort of formalist slash, reader response in week 1. And in week 2, you might have taken a feminist slash, deconstructionist kind of a way. But actually giving a name to the different types of criticism will just help you kind of refine the way that you're going to approach some of these stories. So again, if you are stressed about that, if you have questions, if you feel still lost or how to navigate through that, I am here for you. Please don't hesitate to email me or to give me a call during my office hours. I'm certainly giving feedback to those of you who needed a little push or a little extra. Here's something to think about on your discussion boards. But again, I don't expect you to be an expert on literary criticism. What I do expect you to do is just start to play around with that and to understand that. You won't really have to dive into literary criticism deeply until about week 9 or 10, when we deconstruct, not formally with the criticism, but when we actually take apart some of these poems using particular types of literary criticism. So for week 4, you are going to read about theme, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. You're also going to read A Good Man is Hard to Find, Flannery O'Connor's most famous story. You're also going to read chapters 2 and 3 in your textbook, which really have to do with writing about literature. So for those of you who have had other literature classes, have taken 1C before, or perhaps other, maybe recently 1B, right? This is sort of setting up how do we write about literature and how do we make an argument about that. So if you're familiar with that, you may want to kind of gloss over those pages. But for those of you who it's been a while, or if you've never actually sort of written about literature in a formal way, pay attention to chapters 2 and 3. Also, I would add to that, at the end of every chapter in the short story section, so for instance, at the end of, let's say the lottery, your book offers, like for instance on page 138, a student sample of an analysis of that story. So again, those of you who may be unfamiliar with that, you might want to look over those student essays and just see like, oh, what do those look like? How do they sound? How do they kind of tackle those things? So that way you feel a little bit more familiar with what those particular essays look like. You are also going to read The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman this week. Wonderful story. I think it was written just around the turn of the century, 19th century, and so it's very much in keeping with examining sort of feminism and what's going on, and how are women viewed and how are they treated, and how did they actually feel. And this story at the time was very, very groundbreaking and very disturbing for a lot of people. I also posted on this week your short story essay prompt. Now, it is not due in week 4, so I don't want you to panic about that, but I know a lot of you like to get started on your essays sooner than later, so I thought I would post it in week 4, even though it's not due until week 5. So that way, again, you can sort of start plugging away at that particular essay. I want you to be sure you're reading the Ask a Librarian discussion boards. Annette Young, who is a wonderful human being, but also just a really great librarian, has been kind enough to come into our class and post different discussion boards to help you. This could be help you figure out maybe how to cite or how to avoid plagiarism, but also to find secondary sources. You are going to have to find secondary sources, particularly for this week with the discussion board. And how do you do that? Well, if you start Googling, right, you're going to come up with 900 million results, and probably only a fraction of those would actually be really helpful. And how do you actually narrow that down? So you're in great luck that we have Annette, because you have access to really wonderful databases through your Chafee tuition. And so you can just log into the library and look those right up from the comfort of your own home. So I will be talking about those myself today, but make sure you're also reading through those. Make sure you take your week 4 quiz by Wednesday. Make sure you post your discussion board by Thursday. And then also make sure you respond to 2 classmates by Saturday. So your short story essay is going to be due during week 5. But again, for those of you who like to get started on stuff, or just at least started reading and thinking, here is the assignment. You are going to read Celeste Ng's How to Be Chinese, which is in your textbook on page 931. And you're going to choose either assignment number 1 or assignment number 2. So assignment number 1 says to critically analyze the story from a formalist perspective, where you will select no fewer than 2 fictional elements to help support the meaning of the story. So again, you're going to come up with an interpretation, a theme, if you will. What does the story mean? And support that through a formalist literary criticism. Or you can choose essay 2, which is to compare and contrast how to be Chinese with everyday use. Specifically, I want you to discuss to whom culture belongs in each story and whether or not culture can be acquired. Is it something that's hereditary, or is it something you can learn either formally through education or informally, and so how that happens. So either choose number 1 or number 2, but in both cases you're still reading Celeste Ng's How to Be Chinese. Essay qualifications. You're going to pick a title that best represents the essay. Make sure you have an introduction that doesn't summarize the story, but offers a clear and arguable thesis. You want to make sure that you have topic sentences that should be also very clear, but that are key claims that directly tie into that thesis. Those claims should be clearly defined and put into a logical order. Specific evidence should be provided and quoted according to MLA style to back up your interpretation. Provide connections between your interpretations and your claims. Avoid getting bogged down in summary in the middle of those paragraphs. Make sure grammar and spelling should be eliminated. And essays should be a minimum of 3 full pages. So that means all the way to the bottom of the 3rd page. So essays that are shorter than the minimum are going to receive no higher than a 70%. So that's really important here. Make sure you use standard MLA formatting, which includes double spacing, 1-inch margins, 12-point font, and MLA format should be also adhered to when you cite from the stories and provide a works cited page. So your final draft is going to be due on turnitin.com, again, during week 5. For your week 4 discussion board, of course I want you to make sure that you have completed your weekly reading. But this week, in addition to doing the reading, you're going to also have to find one secondary source to support your interpretation, and I'll go over that in just a second. So in both cases, you're going to be looking at both parts of the discussion board. You're going to be looking at A Good Man is Hard to Find and the Yellow Wallpaper in this week. Remember that anything posted after Thursday for the original discussion board post will receive no credit. Okay, there are 2 parts of this discussion board, and you have to answer both parts for full credit. Also, the discussion board should be a minimum of 300 words total. That doesn't mean for each section. A couple of you are writing really well done essays for your discussion board, and you're freaking everybody out, so stop that. So discussion board, minimum 300 words total, so you can just think about that 150 words for each of these is fine. If you go over that, that's not a big deal, but I do want to emphasize that for those of you who feel like you're having to come up with filler or fluff, or sometimes called BS. in order to get to that word minimum. So I feel like 150 words for each of these things shouldn't be too terribly hard, especially given the nature of how complex the questions usually are. So for part one, decide on a theme for A Good Man is Hard to Find. So you can consider what the story is trying to say about the grandmother and or people like her. And that's just one way to maybe start approaching the theme. Again, when we think about theme, and you're going to do some reading on that, I want you to be sure that you are looking at theme. Sometimes students like to call this like, well, what's the moral of the story? And a lot of contemporary short stories do not have morals to them, meaning that they're not trying to necessarily teach you anything. They are trying to allow the reader to come up with that thing. And whatever that thing is typically called a central idea. Maybe the meaning, you'll hear me use that word a lot, or the interpretation. So that is what theme is. Make sure you understand the difference between theme and subject as well. That's something that's going to come up on the quiz. So for instance, if we were to look at everyday use, the subject or some of the subjects of that particular story might be culture or family or heritage or lineage, right? So those are just some of the more abstract concepts that the story deals with. But the theme, or one of them, might be that culture belongs to those who take part in it, not people who try to own it, right? But who actually participate in it. So if I wanted to write about that particular theme of that story, I would gather all the evidence that I can that would support that idea, right? And maybe make an interpretation about that. Or from the lottery, right? A lot of you did a really good job on those discussion boards picking out that one of the subjects of the lottery is tradition, particularly when it comes to the black box, or how Mr. Summers might approach that, right? But a theme for that perhaps might be, if we don't question outdated traditions, if they go sort of unchecked, then what we end up having is a society that sort of blindly follows an arbitrary system. And so that might be something, again, just an interpretation that many of you came up with in your discussion board, or you sort of arrived at in thinking about that particular story. That's an underlying meaning of the story itself. Same thing if I were to think about the things they carried. Subjects might be love, war, loss, right? Big, broad abstractions. But the story itself, if we zero in and ask ourselves, okay, what's the theme? What's the interpretation? Maybe one theme I might look at is Lieutenant Cross. He's sort of desperate to feel love in order to feel human, because he's in the middle of this very inhuman war. And so perhaps if I wanted to make a larger statement about that theme or that interpretation, again, I would gather all the evidence I could find and attempt to make that argument. So when you are looking at A Good Man is Hard to Find, again, think about that. Read through the story. Ask questions. I'm just flipping through the pages of my story right now, and I'm looking at all the questions I write in the margins as I come across these story. For instance, I'm looking on page 181, paragraph 44. I'm asking myself, is he trying to get her to shut up, right? Again, I'm sort of looking at the grandmother and how people treat her and how she treats other people. She seems to be a very central character in this story, so I like to ask questions in order to kind of arrive at those themes. Same thing with the yellow wallpaper. So consider, right? Again, you already know, since I'm kind of giving you those warnings about women and, how women are treated, you can go through that story and see if you can pick out a theme here. What is it trying to say about how maybe women at the time felt? I certainly think that a lot of us women out there could relate to this character in a lot of ways. Some of these things really haven't changed about how women are treated. Specifically, if I look at how the husband, John, treats the narrator. He infantilizes her a lot of the times. So again, just come up with one idea here, one interpretation, one meaning of what the story is trying to say, and then you're going to support those findings with evidence from the text. You only need one secondary source in the entire discussion board, so you can choose Good Man is Hard to Find or the yellow wallpaper. You don't have to have both for full credit, okay? So I want you to use your time wisely. So these discussion boards, the original ones, are due by Thursday as always, and the discussion board responses are going to be due by Saturday evening. Let me actually show you. Let me see if I can flip over here. So if I were to go onto the Chaffey College Library, there are a lot of really great databases on here, and Annette has very kindly pointed us to one that will be helpful to us particularly. So if I were to click on Literary Reference Center here, what we get is this page right here. And this is a great resource. I can just type in something like, let's see, A Good Man is Hard to Find. And it's going to come up with a whole list of, you can see here, 84 different hits. And what I'm really looking for are sort of maybe critical interpretations. So I tend to sort of shy away a little bit from things that say, you know, a summary of or a review of. What I'm looking for are words like this, a literary analysis. Okay, that might be more interesting, right? Maybe that might help me to support what I'm looking for. Let's see, there was one I read this one earlier, Crisis of Faith. And if you click on these, I think it's really important if you're not already accustomed to looking at a secondary source. Here's what is a good use of your time. I look at two things, mainly two things when I'm looking at these. One is I look at the page number, like how big is the secondary source? If I see that it's a giant 20-page literary analysis, I might actually move on. For me, I don't have a lot of time, and I think that's similar to you and your lifestyles. So I try to look for something that's a little bit more manageable, 7, 8 pages, right? I really don't want to hit up in that 20, 30 page mark because that'll take me a couple hours to read. The other thing that I look at when I'm looking at these articles is the abstract. And all that an abstract means is that it's a summary of what the article is about. So if I look here, it says the article analyzes the short story A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. Good, that's exactly what I was looking for in terms of a secondary source. The characters and plot line are explored. It informs that in the story, O'Connor undercuts the various shallow secular or shallow Christian faiths that either embrace the character. It further informs the faith in God seems both firm and highly important. That seems kind of interesting to me. I read that story, didn't really see a whole lot of, at least in my initial interpretation of faith. And so this idea that maybe faith somehow plays into that. Certainly I see the grandmother expressing that at the end when she's begging the misfit to pray to Jesus. And so what I might do then is click right here where it says PDF full text, and it's going to open up this whole entire file, and I can read this whole work here and see if there's anything here that I think is interesting. Again, don't waste your time. If this seems too long or just way too deep once you start reading this, don't even bother, right? Go on to the next one. There's a lot of literary interpretations out there available for a lot of these stories. For me, I've already actually read this one, and it was good. One thing that the writer expresses here is that the crisis of faith is actually, at least initially, is actually sort of a crisis in family, that the grandmother wants to visit these relatives that she has sort of deep connections with, and yet she doesn't really have connections with the family that she lives with. And so that might be one interpretation that might help me sort of support my interpretation of the grandmother. So I might find a quote that from this particular writer that helps me to support that, right? I might find something like this, right? And be sure if you do quote from these things that you get your authors' names of this, right? You'll want to make sure that you include those in your actual discussion board, just as good practice here. If I go back here, see if my computer will play nice. Come on now. And I type in something like yellow wallpaper. Again, it's going to give me a whole bunch of different results, and I can scroll those and see if there's anything that seems interesting to me. I actually read this one earlier today, a dynamic symbol, and this one wasn't that great. I didn't think it was anything to sort of rave about, but I do want you to choose something that you feel like, okay, that already supports some ideas that I have, or that you can use and incorporate it somehow. I do have the expectation, though, that if you are quoting these sources, that you actually read the entire thing, right? Certainly, as you know, being a college student, right, something that's stated at the beginning of an article might not necessarily be true all the way at the end. So please, again, approach these academically and read through the whole thing so you have an understanding of those. You only need one, though. So don't overwhelm yourself with trying to find a whole bunch of this stuff or spending too much time reading them. Again, read through those, see if its page numbers are doable for you. Read through the abstract. If the abstract doesn't sound great, maybe go on to the next thing, see what you come up with, okay? So some of these articles too, you can get really lucky and you can listen to them. So sometimes while I drive, I like to listen to these just to see if it's even worth sort of exploring and reading later, especially for those of you who like audio better than you do visually reading those words. One other thing I want to point out to you this week that might be helpful to you is the Purdue Online Writing Lab, which I think I've pointed out to you before. But especially for those of you who, again, are sort of maybe unfamiliar with writing about literature in a formal way, this resource is really invaluable to students, I think. It helps students come up with what is a literary argument, right? What is a debatable thesis statement? It gives you really good examples. It can even help here give you topics, how to format, which is really, really helpful. So here's some topics that are good, right? Here's how to format, which is really helpful, especially those of you who are unsure about MLA in general, right? You can click through that and it'll help you a little bit. Certainly I'm around to help you as well. I don't want you to feel lost on that stuff. I'm just clicking back here through week 4 so I can wrap this up, see if there's anything I forgot. So nothing else to speak of. Like I said, if you want to get started on week 5's essay, you certainly can do that. Again, I'm here to help. Make sure that you contact me if you need something. Work on theme this week. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other on the discussion board, and keep pressing. This is really a good class. You guys are really diving in deep with literature in ways that I didn't expect you to be this far in week 3. So kiss your brains. And I will see you on the discussion boards. Bye.